We invite Marta Libertà De Bastiani, our next speaker. Marta is currently a member of the PRIN project, Compassion in Action, Theories of Sympathy and Construction of Otherness in the Long 18th Century at the Università di Roma III. Her research focuses on early modern history of philosophy and political philosophy. In this regard, she has primarily studied Machiavelli and early modern Machiavellianism, Hobbes, Rousseau, and especially Spinoza. Recently, she has dedicated herself to studying the mechanisms of sympathy in the thought of Flora Tristan, and more broadly, to the reworking of the concept of sympathy in socialist and feminist thought in 19th century France. She co-edited the volume Amiche colende, struttura, temi e linguaggio nell'epistolario spinoziano with Sandra Manzi in Mimesis, 2021, and also co-edited the volume Amicizie, itinerari storici e attualità politica with Luca Cianca in Efesto, 2017. She is also the author of Ex auditu ex signis, citazioni, riferimenti e storie antiche nella filosofia politica di Spinoza, with Mimesis in 2023. She contributes to the journal Consecutio Rerum and is currently the president of the Societas Spinozana. Today she will be presenting a paper titled Spinoza and the Psychology of Sadness, Homage to Human Fragility.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and the organizers, of course. Before delving into the core subject of my presentation today on Spinoza and sadness, I would like to briefly explain the two primary reasons for choosing this particular topic. The first reason pertains to what we might call the letter of Spinoza. Some time ago, during a conference, I heard someone argue that Spinoza's concept of man and woman, with capital M and capital W, refers to the figure in the fifth part of the Ethics, the free man and the free woman. Today, I would like to challenge this interpretation of Spinoza's thought. In my view, Spinoza is at least as concerned with explaining how people usually feel and think as he is with outlining the path to becoming a free person. The second reason is connected to what we might call the spirit of Spinoza. It seems to me that in contemporary Western societies, there is a tendency to dismiss negative emotion like anger, sadness, or fear, treating them as obstacles to be overcome quickly in order to lead a meaningful life, achieve professional success, and economic wealth. For example, the shelves in the bookstores are often filled with many self-help books that encourage people to let go of negative thoughts, be active, and achieve efficiency to accomplish their goals. These books typically offer practical advice for easily and quickly overcoming negative emotions, emphasizing individual willpower as the key to success. They also frequently dismiss or disdain traditional psychoanalysis or psychological therapy on the grounds that these approaches take too much time. Additionally, I've noticed that the psychological equilibrium of young people, especially, is frequently challenged by what we could call a rhetoric of success and positivity. Many of them feel immense pressure to meet high expectation and view any negative emotion as unusual or wrong. On social media, they're constantly exposed to images of fabulous vacation, gourmet meals, and incredible experiences. Rarely do they see posts about an uneventful Tuesday night spent going to bed at 10 p.m. after a quick dinner of rice and tuna, or about mundane activities like washing dishes or paying bills. Yet, we all surely pay our bills more often than we embark on an extraordinary trip to Bali. Feeling bored, angry, lonely, or sad has become something to be quickly fixed, as though it is inherently wrong. To begin with today's topic, it is clear that no one desires to be sad, angry, bored, or to spend all of the time paying bills. More importantly, it would be unreasonable to claim that Spinoza's overall thought encourages sadness or the affects related to it. In fact, it's quite the opposite, as we all know. In Spinoza's view, sadness is an affect, and more precisely, I quote, a passion by which the mind passes to a lesser perfection, or, more generally, I quote again, a man's passage from a greater to a lesser perfection. Since the essence of human being is the striving to persevere in their being, sadness is a passion that hinders this striving. It diminishes the body's capacity for action and the mind's ability to think. For this reason, Spinoza states that, I quote, sadness is directly evil, where evil is defined as what we certainly know prevents us from being masters of some good. Guided by our striving, whether we hold adequate or inadequate ideas, we naturally seek out what brings us joy and avoid what causes sadness. The mind, as far as it can, strives to imagine those things that increase or aid the body's power of acting, says Spinoza. And conversely, when the mind imagines those things that diminish or restrain the body's power of acting, it strives, as far as it can, to recollect things that exclude their existence. Eventually, when we act only in relation to the laws of our nature, which is the same striving to persevere in our being, we have adequate, not inadequate ideas, and thus we are active, not passive. Consequently, as far as we act and think only in accordance to our nature, we are not subject to sadness, which is a passion, and we become even more than joyful. Leti, in Latin, we become blessed, beati. However, there is a reason why Spinoza calls the spontaneous movement of our mind and body a striving, and he says that we strive to be joyful as far as we can. Quantum incest, quantum potest are the two Latin formulas. In fact, we are a part of nature, surrounded by many things, and, I quote, the force by which a man perseveres in existing is limited and infinitely surpassed by the power of external causes. Since we are a part of nature, as Spinoza frequently emphasizes, it is impossible for us to experience only those changes that can be understood through our own nature alone, where we are the adequate cause. This means that we are always necessarily subject to passions, and that we follow and obey the common order of nature, accommodating ourselves to it as much as the nature of the things requires. These considerations lead us to my first aim today, which is to underline that sadness, like all other passions, is unavoidable. We cannot expect to act always and only according to our nature, remaining active at all times. Eventually, something will occur that diminishes our striving to persevere in our being, and we will inevitably feel sad. Since sadness is an affect, it implies a relationship between us and the other things or people. Some of these will increase our power of acting and thinking, while others will diminish it, making us sad. However, this does not mean that we are necessarily trapped in a state of never-ending despair. There is a particularly interesting passage in Ethics 4, Proposition 32, where Spinoza, after noting once again that, I quote, human power is very limited and infinitely surpassed by the power of external causes, and that we do not have an absolute power to adapt things outside us to our use, adds, nevertheless, we shall bear calmly those things which happen to us contrary to what the principle of our advantage demands, if we are conscious that we have done our duty, that the power we have could not have extended itself to the point where we could have avoided those things, and that we are a part of the world nature, whose order we follow. So we can endure negative events and encounters as long as, 1, we are conscious that we have done our duty, 2, we are conscious that we have a limited power, 3, we are conscious that we are a part of nature. Thus, the real challenge in effectively dealing with sad affects is not that we experience something or someone that hurts us, leading to sadness. The issue arises when we believe that we could have avoided that encounter and the resulting feeling. The issue with sadness stems from our misconceptions about the nature of the will and of freedom. We tend to think that we were free to avoid that event or person, and consequently free to avoid feeling sad. This misunderstanding becomes evident when we consider how Spinoza begins the fifth part of the Ethics by criticizing Descartes' approach to the passions, which is based on the idea of free will. Contrary to Descartes, Spinoza asserts that the will and the intellect are one and the same. This means that we are not free in the sense of having the ability to act otherwise, but in recognizing the necessity of all things and actions. We are not born free in the absolute sense, but we can become free by striving to act only according to our nature and doing everything that truly lies within our power, while acknowledging that the common order of nature does not adhere to human rules. This is why we can counter sadness by knowing that we have done our duty, meaning we have done everything within our limited power. Spinoza reminds us that, I quote, an affect toward a thing we imagine to be free is greater than toward a thing we imagine to be necessary. And, I quote again, insofar as the mind understands all things as necessary, it has a greater power over the affects. Experience confirms this, I quote again, for we see that sadness over some good which has perished is lessened as soon as the man who has lost it realizes that this good could not, in any way, have been kept. In the end, dispelling sadness begins with accepting that our power of acting and thinking is inherently limited, since we are not the only creatures on this planet. Therefore, the first step in confronting sadness is to accept it, acknowledging our fragility with tenderness and understanding. Accepting the inevitability of sadness involves recognizing that we are a part of nature, which is not oriented solely towards our benefit. This brings us to the second point of my presentation. Highlighting how, in a certain sense, sadness is neither evil nor inherently imperfect. In Spinoza's thought, the concept of perfection has more than one meaning. One of these is absolute or ontological perfection, which refers to the inherent perfection of God and all things that necessarily follow from God's action. As Spinoza states, I quote, whatever exists begins that follow from God's action is perfect. And, I quote again, things have been produced by God with the highest perfection, since they have followed necessarily from a given most perfect nature. Since everything exists as a result of God's action, everything that exists is perfect. Thus, as Spinoza asserts, I quote, by reality and perfection, I understand the same thing. In this sense, every human being, like any other thing, is perfect, regardless of whether they have inadequate or adequate ideas, or whether they are subject to passion or not. The same applies to the notion of good and evil. Nothing in nature is inherently good or bad, as everything follows from God's action. However, there is another sense in which things are called perfect or imperfect, depending on our teleological way of thinking. We are accustomed to view, I quote, all natural things as means to our own advantage, and to believe that there is someone, I quote again, who had taken care of all things for us and made all things for our use. Generally speaking, because we are driven by our conatus towards certain ends, we also attribute this teleological movement to nature itself. Consequently, we tend to believe that, as Spinoza puts it, I quote, nature does nothing in vain, nothing which is not of the use to man. When we convince ourselves that everything that happens occurs for our benefit, we judge and rate as most excellent those things that most please us. Thus, we form universal notions of good and evil, order and disorder, and so on. However, since God's action is not aimed to please or oppose human beings, nothing, as Spinoza states, I quote, considered in its own nature will be called perfect or imperfect, especially after we have recognized that everything that happens according to the eternal order and according to certain laws of nature. Moreover, since all things are necessitated, in nature there is no good and no evil. Therefore, Spinoza argues, perfection and imperfection, like good and evil, are only modes of thinking, notion we are accustomed to feign because we compare individuals to the same species or genus to one another. We can only call things perfect or imperfect by relating them to an imagined model in our minds. However, from an ethical perspective, the notion of perfection and imperfection can still hold significant meaning. Spinoza observes that we desire, I quote, to form an idea of a man as a model of human nature which we may look to. By referencing this model, we can judge things as good or evil. Good is defined as, I quote, what we know certainly is a means by which we may approach nearer and nearer to the model of human nature that we set before ourselves. Whereas evil is what we certainly know prevents us from becoming like that model. Consequently, we assess individuals as more or less perfect based on how closely they approximate this model. Ethical perfection and imperfection are thus useful concepts, but somehow limited. They are limited first because they refer only to a model of human nature, rather than to individuals themselves. And second, because they consider only this model without accounting for the broader context of the common order of nature. If we now apply these considerations to sadness, we understand why it can be defined as the passage from a greater to a lesser perfection, and not, as Spinoza says, the lesser perfection itself, and neither a privation of a greater perfection. From the perspective of the model of human nature, whose essence is the striving to persevere in its being, sadness is experienced when the spontaneous action of our conatus is restrained. Thus, when we refer to the model of human nature, sadness is considered evil, because it diminishes our capacity for action and thought. However, since sadness follows from the common order of nature, no affect can be deemed inherently good or evil. As Spinoza notes, human affects and properties are just like other natural things, and, I quote, if they do not indicate man's power, at least indicate the power and skill of nature, no less than many other things we wonder and we take pleasure in contemplating. Consequently, while sadness, like any other affect, reflects the power and skill of nature, it is not inherently imperfect. However, this does not mean that sadness is unreal and that some objects or people are not evil for us. It is true that certain things constrain our striving and are therefore perceived as evil for us, for each one of us, prompting us to avoid them and the sadness they bring. That the concept of perfection and imperfection, good and evil, are constructs of reason and modes of thinking means simply that, when considering the entirety of nature, rather than just the model of human nature, nothing is inherently good or bad, perfect or imperfect. Thus, nothing is inherently a cause of sadness. Instead, sadness arises from the relationship between an individual and an object or person that is detrimental to that individual. Far from serving as a eulogy for sadness, Spinoza's approach emphasizes that sadness is sometimes unavoidable and should be understood rather than judged. In fact, it may even merit a degree of appreciation, as it reflects the power of nature. By understanding sadness in this manner, we can better equip ourselves to cope with it without becoming trapped in a cycle of despair. In other words, recognizing that sadness is an inevitable part of our experience and not an inherent imperfection can guide us to the path toward enduring joy and true blessedness. We must dispel sadness in order to not fall into all the misery that necessarily brings with it. Whichever we do, it must be with joy, asserts Spinoza in the short treatise, a view he maintains throughout his work. But how can we effectively cope with sadness? The answer, as Spinoza suggests, lies in improving our knowledge, by progressing from imagination to reason and ultimately to intuition. The final step toward blessedness is the intellectual love of God, which, according to Spinoza, I quote, feeds the mind with a joy entirely exempt from sadness. Although we instinctively try to recall things that exclude the existence of the object or person causing our sadness, this removal practice has its limitations. Firstly, it is an imaginative approach which can lead to errors in judgment. In fact, I quote, anything can be the accidental cause of joy, sadness, or desire. Secondly, it is insufficient for truly overcoming sadness. In the scholium of Ethics 5, Proposition 20, Spinoza outlines 5 points that illustrate the power of the mind over the affects. 2 of these are particularly relevant to our discussion. The first point recommends gaining knowledge of the affects themselves. Rather than avoiding or repressing our affects, including sadness, we should experience them fully and understand their causes. As Spinoza asserts, I quote, an affect, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. Additionally, understanding these causes as acting by necessity is crucial, since, as Spinoza states, I quote, insofar as the mind understands all things as necessary, it has a greater power over the affects. The second steps demand to, I quote again, separate the affects from the thought of an external cause, which we imagine confusedly. We should therefore recognize that nothing is inherently a cause of sadness when we consider the common order of nature, rather than limiting our view to the model of human nature or to our particular perception as individuals. Remembering that we are merely a part of nature, surrounded by things that act in various ways according to their own necessity, allows us to discern their true nature apart from the effect they provoke in us. Ultimately, this understanding should enable us to see everything as a source of joy, since all things are expressions of God's action. As Spinoza says, I quote, insofar as we understand the causes of sadness, it ceases to be sadness. And, I quote again, insofar as we understand God to be the cause of sadness, we rejoice. In conclusion, the way out of sadness is neither to avoid the objects or people that cause it, nor to eliminate or overcome it through sheer force of will. Quite the contrary. As Spinoza states, I quote, he who understands himself and his affects clearly and distinctly loves God, and does so the more he understands himself and his affects. By gaining knowledge of ourselves and our emotional reactions, we come to comprehend how and why certain things or people either hinder or support our striving. Simultaneously, by reflecting on the common order of nature, we become more at peace with our own fragility as parts of a larger whole, and we learn to joyfully accept whatever comes our way. These considerations bring me to my final point. Contrary to certain interpretations, Spinoza men and women, again with a capital M and W, are not simply those described in the fifth part of the Ethics, or rather, not exclusively. Since the free man, the homo liber, to whom the fifth part is devoted, represents the exemplar humanae naturae, the model of human nature, mentioned at the end of part 4, it cannot encompass all of humanity, though it serves as the ideal toward which we should strive. Most people are not homini liberi, nor they will ever be, and even the homo liber is not free at all times. The exemplar humanae naturae should guide our thoughts and actions in order to improve ourselves and eventually reach blessedness, just as the pole star guides the sailor. In this way, Spinoza demonstrates a keen interest both in explaining how people think and feel usually, and in laying out a model for human fulfillment. Thus, I believe that the Ethics offers a marvelous and passionate portrait of both the power and the fragility of humanity. Moreover, Spinoza's psychology of sadness and negative affects provides a valuable counterpoint to contemporary prêt-à-porter psychological theories and the advice found in many self-help manuals. According to Spinoza, not being dominated by sadness does not mean avoiding it, thinking positive, or using willpower to dispel it. Instead, it involves experiencing sadness and understanding our fragility as creatures, acknowledging that our nature is both limited and powerful. In addition, successfully coping with sadness does not imply that we are entirely shielded from the external forces that contradict or oppose us. For example, attributing professional success or economic growth solely to the individual responsibility is, in Spinoza's view, rooted in imagination rather than reason, since many external factors lie beyond our control. Furthermore, challenging the simplistic rhetoric of positivity and success through a Spinozistic lens could help young adults and all of us cultivate a more balanced self-image, fostering acceptance. After all, Spinoza teaches that the proper feeling we should develop about ourselves is neither pride, superbia, nor despondency, humilitas. As Spinoza states, I quote, "The highest thing we can hope for is self-esteem, acquiescentia in se ipso, a joy that arises from understanding two key aspects. First, that reason is our true power of acting, and second, that we can clearly discern what lies within our control and what does not. In conclusion, only by coming to terms with our own fragility can we effectively cope with sadness, becoming stronger and less susceptible to negative passions, not because we avoid it or counter it, but because we accept it and understand it. More importantly, as we navigate life, striving for survival and happiness, we must constantly remember that the journey toward blessedness is neither easy nor swift. It is a long and challenging path that requires considerable time and reflection. Thank you.
Thank you.